Okay, so before we start with any watercolor, I want you to take a crayon, and where it says crayon resist, I want you to draw a very small little icon. So wet on dry means the paper needs to be dry first before you start. That means the paper can be dry or the layer of watercolor before can be dry. And when I pause the video and I want you to do this step, I want you to use the red watercolor. Now we're going to move on to wet on wet. So that means that you can either paint directly on another color that's already wet, or in this case, I'm showing you what it would be like if you were to put water down first. So when you take the red paint and you just lightly dab it on there, it will spread. And you want to make sure that you're very careful about where you place the water because it will want to fill up any water that you've placed before. So this next step is pretty self-explanatory. I want you to use blue, and you can do the wet on dry technique. And once you have a decent amount of blue paint, I need you to take a very small amount of salt and lightly dust the paper. And then I need you to let it dry. Don't touch it, don't mess with it. We're going to do crayon resist later. So we're going to make a value scale out of watercolor. So more paint and less water is going to transition to less paint and more water. So now we're going to use blue, and we're going to use more paint than we are water. Obviously you need water to activate the paint, but if you notice, the term pigmented or saturated, that means it's really, really bright, it's rich in color. And that's what we're going for, because that's technically what a dark value would be in regards to a watercolor piece. Now, as we move along to the right side, you're noticing, or you should be noticing, that it's getting lighter because you're using more water. If you're noticing that it's not getting lighter, then that means you need to use more water. And if you're saying that it's too light, then maybe you need to use more paint. You just have to figure out what you need more or less of. So as you're going to the right, you should have more water on your paper and less paint. So I always just start with a little bit of paint, and then I just progressively add more water. But I noticed these two values look the same. So I stopped, I took my paper towel, and I lightly dabbed all of my paint in the paper towel. That's a way that you can essentially erase, but it will kind of stain and leave a mark. So just be mindful it's not the most perfect solution if you mess up. I hope you've been noticing as well that I'm constantly drying off my brush in between each of my dipping in the water and using the paint. I recommend you hold a paper towel. That way it can help lighten some of the values. And for the very last value, again, it should be the tiniest little bit of paint and more water. A trick is to actually use the brush as an eraser as well. So if you constantly dry off your brush, it will absorb all the paint. If you notice right now in the video, I'm literally just dabbing the brush and then picking up the paint. I'm not getting more water and I'm not getting more paint. I'm just lightly dabbing it, and now it's super light. So there's something that's called pooling, and that's when you have a lot of these dark areas. That means the paint is kind of drifting to one side and it's going to dry really dark in that one area. So what you can do is you can pick up your paper and kind of move the paint around, and you can kind of see it move. But you need to be very mindful that other things on your paper or your painting will also move when you pick it up. So you need to keep your eye on all of the paints that are wet. Do a water check and see if it's too dirty, and if it is, you need to go get fresh water. So these last 3 boxes, we're going to learn how to use the lid of our watercolor palette to mix new colors. And so we're going to literally be mixing directly onto the lid using water and all that before it goes onto the paper. And then once you're done, you need to make sure that you actively wipe down all of your stuff, and I'll demonstrate right now. So I'm taking orange, but honestly for these last 3 boxes, you can take whatever colors you want and you can just experiment mixing. Make sure that you are drying off your brush before you get a new color, or you're going to ruin the watercolor palette. Once you've figured out what color you're wanting to mix, then you paint inside that box. And if you make a mistake like I did in the video, you can just rip off a piece of paper towel, lightly dab it, and bada bing, it should have kind of erased. Once you have finished with that one first box, then you need to make sure you're wiping down your lid before you do the next. But let's go back and work on that crayon resist that is still needing to be worked on in that upper right. I took the green because it's essentially the complement to the magenta crayon I had. Feel free to use whatever color, but you should notice that the watercolor does not touch the crayon. Voila! Once you have everything complete, place it on the drying rack.